I almost didn't know whether to wait for some clapping or not. Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Secret Lives of Open Source Designers. This is a summary of a somewhat lengthy document report of some diary studies that we did with designers contributing to open source. So this is going to go quite quick. It might not answer, actually, it certainly will not answer a lot of the questions that you might have as you listen. But one would hope that that 40-page document on GitHub would, of which you can find the links at the bottom of the slides to two of the repos that are the same ones, just a version that I forked to my own private GitHub. Both are the same, you can get the same content. Okay, very quickly, just because I kind of figured maybe people don't know me as much in this community, I'm Eriol Fox. I've been doing digital product design and UX, user experience, for over 15 years. I've been doing it specifically in open source software, both paid and contributions voluntarily for the last 7+ years. Actually, I think it's probably 8 now. I lose track of time. Right now, I work as one of 4 senior product designers over at the Open Home Foundation that make Home Assistant, which has been talked a bit about here already. But previous to the Open Home Foundation and working on Home Assistant, I worked primarily on humanitarian and human rights and privacy and security related open source software. So I worked at Ushahidi. They did a lot of work for election-based crowdsourcing open source platforms. I worked at the Open Food Network. I've worked a little bit on Civi CRM here and there. And then when I was at Superbloom, which the organization that I was at when I did this research, we worked on privacy and security tools to do with like PGP and private messaging and things like that. So I'm a maintainer at opensourcedesign.net. If you didn't know about opensourcedesign.net, please investigate it. It's a community of designers in open source and has been going on for more than 10 years now. I've been running a FOSDEM dev room for the last 6 years. This is me looking, I got told several times at FOSDEM this year that I looked particularly tired, and which is, I guess, like incremental the more years that you do stuff at FOSDEM, like running a dev room, which I thought was quite funny. I'm one of the podcast hosts over at Sustain Open Source Software. If you've heard of Sustain Open Source Software, they produce a really fantastic podcast on lots of different topics to do with sustaining open source software. And really, I'm all about, and have been for the last 8+ years, about how do designers understand and get introduced to open source software, how do they contribute, how does open source software learn about designers and design, and how does that become more persistent in the open source software, free and open source software world. The other things I do, if I didn't already have a lot of things on the things that I do list, I'm on the advisory board for the Open Technology Fund's FOSS Sustainability Fund. I advise the Open Source Ethical License, which also produced the Contributor Covenant, I believe, and have a new version recently. And I'm also a Penpot.app ambassador. Penpot is an alternative to Figma, so it's an open source UI UX prototyping tool, which I highly recommend you check out if you are absolutely fed up of proprietary design UX tools. Enough about me now. About the study that we did and the quick summary of it. So back in 2022, which feels like quite a long time ago now, Vermont Complex Systems at the University of Vermont awarded the organization that I was working at the time, Superbloom, a Ocean grant. It's a fantastic program, actually. It's about funding research into areas of open source that often don't get researched. So a lot of the code quality and code contributions gets researched, but not a lot of the community aspects, and certainly not designers in open source software. They gave us a very small grant to look into what designers are doing in open source. How are they contributing? Why? What are they producing? And those kinds of things. But we also wanted to make sure that this was able to be done in an privacy-respecting way, because there aren't that many designers in open source comparative to people creating code. If I were to get up here and tell you about a designer that is contributing to a project and name that project, there's probably only 1 or 2, maybe 10 at most designers that you could actually name. So it's actually not that hard to find out who the designers are in this study if you knew the project names. So that's one of the reasons why we've omitted the specific open source project names from this study, because you could kind of figure out who the designers are. But yeah, this is what we hope to do with the diary study. The study wanted to investigate some key questions related to design and open source and fill in some of these larger gaps. There's actually not that much research done about design and usability in open source. There's more research that's been done on how effective usability has been implemented in open source rather than the people that are doing the usability work and how successful that usability work is. But here we have a quote which is, design in open source is often done by the developers and rarely by developers with design skills or designers or developers that are confident in their design skills. And it's difficult to understand where the roles and boundaries are and at what stages of open source software create optimal conditions for success for usability design and anything kind of in that area. So this is really the statement of what we wanted to try and investigate. Some of the research questions, just because I don't want to go too over time, so I won't go into all of the questions that we asked. So some of them were, what is a design contribution and how is design understood within open source software communities? And then some other questions to the designers, what we started with. So our research questions were these were the questions we were trying to help understand and answer as part of the study. We started with some interviews with designers. We actually had like a selection process where we, opened up, hey, who wants to be part of this study? And we selected from the people that applied 5 people, 5 designers of different kinds of projects. And we started with interviews with those designers and we asked these kinds of questions. So how did you start in open source? How did you decide what open source software project to contribute to or work on? And this is a little bit of information about the designers, the 5 designers that we did this study with. If folks aren't familiar with a diary study, essentially it's over a longer period of time than sort of an hour or so. It's usually multiple weeks. Here we did 10 to 15 weeks because we wanted the designers to have enough freedom with what weeks they reported on. So we went from 10 to 15 weeks. And these are the kinds of, this is the kind of information about the designers that were studied. We gave them code names, whether they were working part-time or full-time, how they were employed, whether they identified as students, how many projects they were contributing to at the time. And within the answers that they gave to the diary study questions each week, there was more information about, obviously, what they were doing on any given week, which are these kinds of questions. So every week we would send out a request for that diary study information from these designers around these kinds of topics. They had options on how they could respond to these questions. We gave them a survey that they could answer, but we also invited audio files, video files, if they really wanted to have a conversation to try and explain something quite complex, they could do so. Most designers opted to write their responses. Oh, and one of the other important things is the small grant that we got was 5,000 USD from Vermont Complex Systems, which isn't a huge amount of money, but all of that money went to pay the designers to participate. So we gave each designer 1,000 USD to participate in the diary study, and then my organization paid for my time to do the study part. So we contributed in kind with time. But yeah, the kinds of questions that we were asking designers weekly are these ones here. So what are the communication processes for designers when they're contributing? How were they contributing? How did they define success? Was it a successful contribution that week? What tools were they using? So we wanted to try and figure out what were designers preferring open source software alternatives over proprietary design tools? Were they investigating that within their contribution process? And then what kinds of design actually were they producing on a given week? Sadly, we can't make that data public because, again, it's design files of logos of the open source projects that they were contributing to, so it would expose them. But we were receiving research documents, so lots of documentation, lots of user research information and data, community engagement work, UI design files, markdown files, SVGs, and different graphics, both contributed directly to repositories, but also in other other softwares as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the different topics that came up in the study, just to give you a flavor of this study, should you want to investigate it further. So one of the big topics that came out of the study was about designer and developer collaboration in open source software. So this was a recurring theme, and all designers that used some kind of, well, mostly GitHub and GitLab in this study, because there weren't that many other designers using other SourceForges or interacting with other SourceForges projects that were using other SourceForges. But they were all seen as tools for developers. So the designers were kind of immediately coming into an ecosystem where the tools were not really ever meant to consider them, or they thought that we're considering them in the ways that they were working. But they also, as well as struggling with those tools and feeling like they weren't represented, they had to hack ways around sharing what they wanted to share, having conversations that they needed to have in order to contribute. They all described using those kinds of tools and communication and collaboration with developers as a critical part of their contribution success and enjoyment. So collaboration is critical to a designer's successful contribution. Some of the stuff that I'm going to tell you is kind of maybe like, well, of course, that would be critical. But this is just to reiterate that designers are really typically having a lot of the same needs that developers and code contributors are having, but they come across a lot of barriers because the ecosystems aren't made for them. So I always put this one in my slide deck, mostly because I found it funny one time when I gave this talk and a lot of people from GitLab were in the audience. So these quotes on the screen at the moment are, "I'm not sure the best way to use GitLab for design tickets." So these are quotes from designers during the study. There's lots of quotes in the study document. And the second one is, "I hate GitLab. It's confusing and the team did not put me as a developer yet." And so this is really interesting because what this problem is describing is that the designer was assumed to not need access, the same level of access as developers. And when they came to contribute in the project, they found that they had to explicitly ask for what they actually didn't know the level of access that they needed. So they just weren't being met with like information in order to get the information that they needed to do the work that they wanted to, but also they struggled to articulate what they didn't know they needed in a lot of cases. So this is a case of not being assigned the correct level of, or the level of permissions that they needed. This is a really interesting, I think, phenomena, which I think is a good one generally. Typically, in the collaboration process, developers were more involved in design conversations and processes when the designers were having those, were able to have those conversations, either asynchronously or synchronously, however they were able to have them. And again, as I said, getting responses from developers about design proposals was a crucial step in the process, an absolutely crucial step in the process. So these kind of, maybe these assumptions that come from somewhere else about designers not wanting feedback and conversations from the technical people is completely incorrect. But the interesting thing was this was not reversed. So there was an assumption that designers absolutely wouldn't be interested in having conversations or being involved in conversations about APIs or the back-end infrastructure or servers or anything to do with the project that was important that wasn't deemed the area of design. And that was just a huge missed opportunity because sometimes designers have really interesting ideas in how these other technical aspects could be changed or done differently, especially since like an API endpoint is something that a user interacts with in some way, so is a user experience. But there was just this assumption that they weren't going to participate in these conversations, so we don't include them by default. So you should consider including them by default. Openness practices in the design side of things is still kind of like a tricky and evolving topic, because a lot of the designers didn't, well, some of the designers came from a development background, and actually this is quite common in open source designers, that they may be trained as a coder or a developer engineer and then kind of shifted into design side of things, which is quite common, I've seen. But still, openness practices kind of aren't inherent within the design world and education. It's not prevalent, it's not pervasive in design. So they often struggle to understand what the openness practices that they should or could do, what the opportunities were there. But there certainly was a motivation to be more open from the designers, but there also wasn't necessarily a lot of knowledge on the code side of things of how they could be, because there was just missing information all around. Like, how can somebody that's always been about the openness of the code situation, begin to think, oh, well, how could this apply to design, until you are presented with the conundrum, the question, the challenge. But there was a lot of motivation for openness within the design side of things, mostly because it made designers really happy to be publishing their stuff openly as they possibly could. Because, like we all, well, most of us like positive affirmations and reinforcement on the work that we're doing, and hopefully that it meets the needs and is good. But yeah, when designers shared documents, user research documents with the team at this organization, it was great. They enjoyed it because other designers could make input, so they got to participate in community from the design side of things in the same way that coders often do. So essentially, I kind of read this as designers inviting a code review, but design review within whatever they're doing. But like to just explain here, designers don't really have the vocabulary yet for things like what's the difference between a nitpick or other kinds of elements. So that kind of stuff is still evolving, and actually could be really, really useful in design contributions as well if we extended the vocabulary of things like nitpicks and code reviews to design artifacts. So yeah, I heard back from somebody I shared open design resources with that it was helpful and that they will be using our contributions. Again, a pretty standard quote, which you would hope would happen, but it's just really meaningful to make sure that everyone knows that designers find it really helpful and really great when people value their contributions and they see them. It does tend to take more effort generally, documenting and sharing and collaborating though. So designers, like I said, these skills aren't inherent to designers, so they often do need a bit of prompting or some documentation to help them. I'm just aware of time. Okay, so a big bulk of the report kind of focused on what is a successful design contribution. So we had some sections about success and how we could try and define success, and then what we did in the report is we took the information around what these designers described as successful design contributions in open source, and we tried to transform them into recommendations for projects. So that's the kind of format of the report. So I'm just going to talk about, I think, one or two, because we don't have time for all of them. But feedback was a really interesting one and a really important one, which is maybe why it's number one. So design contributions in open source success measured by feedback when feedback is relevant and useful. And again, it's kind of like a pretty normal statement. Make sure your feedback is relevant and useful to the topic at hand. But I think this was frequently coming up in the design diary studies weekly reports, because often the designers weren't quite sure on how to funnel the feedback to be the most useful kind of feedback that they need to address the challenge that they need, because sometimes they also didn't necessarily, kind of goes to one of the other success metrics about what is a priority for the open source, because sometimes the feedback that they were getting wasn't clear towards what the goal of the thing that they were working on was. So they really needed relevant and useful feedback. So the designers tended to assume that they got it right. So if they submitted a design contribution, there's no feedback, great, I got it right, I'm just gonna leave it, fantastic, if there was no feedback. But this was less so if the designer wasn't confident that they understood the domain of the open source, which is often the case because there's not a lot of access to information, especially if it's a open source project that's a little bit more technical, a little bit harder to understand what it's trying to do, and you're coming in as a designer without those kinds of skills, then they were less confident with their design if there was no feedback and they weren't able to kind of like problem solve themselves, essentially, like assert themselves that they had gotten to the right answer. But slow feedback was also viewed negatively by designers, and a lack of communication was seen as like a progress blocker. And so this is I find this really interesting and challenging because we know that open source projects all have different timelines on how things happen. Sometimes things happen quickly in some projects, sometimes things happen incredibly slowly in other projects. And that's not bad or good, it's just how the projects are. But the designers are applying usually a different model, a different experience of, oh, well, this is how software gets built. If I give this contribution, it's going to get built, it's going to get fed back on. They don't really know that there might be a cultural thing in open source where I'll get to it when I get to it, especially if it's a hobby project. And so without access to that statement written somewhere in a README, I'll get to it when I get to it, or a comment on an issue or somewhere that they can see, they just basically assume that either they got it correct, perfect, or, oh, well, if I'm not getting any feedback at all, it must be really bad. Maybe I'll message several times. Oh, why are you messaging so much? Gosh, you're too insistent that you want this design, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of like, if you can just make it clear what your communication will be, I'll get to this. You know, you can even have, I think, bots now that do that on some platforms that say, I will get to this at a certain point, or this will happen. But yeah, designers wanted relevant and useful feedback. So what they didn't want as well is feedback that kind of went off into a, yeah, but this feature over here that this touched over here, unless it was directly relevant and you were able to explain, like, okay, if you change something over here because of the architecture, all these other things will happen. So they don't automatically know those kinds of things. So it needs to be relevant, and it can't kind of go into other feature discussions or those kinds of things. I hope that makes sense. Relevant and useful feedback, important for designers. So yeah, some quotes really quickly. Success is when I get feedback on what's wrong with my design and what the next steps are. So suggesting next steps. So try this, or have you looked at this, or have you looked at this documentation? Can you talk to these people that use it in this way? Can you go do this is very useful. And then some about the delay in feedback. Designers just tend to leave projects if they're not really getting interacted with. And that leads to this whole other aspect that's in the report, where a lot of open source software projects think designers are flaky and that they just won't commit to contribution, but they're just not getting talked to. So yeah, they're going to go to a project that knows what they want, can talk to them, but that doesn't have to be frequently, it just has to be clear. I think I'm going to skip through this one really quickly. Maybe I'll just go, prioritize your things that you want, because then designers can go, oh, I can go work on this, which is a priority. It's kind of that simple in a sense. But designers really want some kind of understanding of what you want to fix, most of all. And really, don't kind of, we all want that, actually. Everyone could benefit from, this is the most impactful thing that you can work on right now. But designers particularly want it because they also can't find those things themselves, because they're not going through the process of, not always going through the process of, I'm using this open source, I found my own bug, I logged my own bug, I solved my own bug. That is not the common designer process in open source. Oh. Okay, there was extra bit about inclusion and collaboration, but I don't think we've got time for this. There's a whole section about what might make designers leave a project. This is typically if all of their time is spent documenting and explaining design. Like, this is why you need design. If they spend all of their time trying to convince you why they can, how they can help you and why they want to help you, and not doing design work, imagine if you never wrote a line of code ever and all you did was argue. It's the same for designers, essentially. They want to design, they want to help you understand why usability and design is important, but also just let them do some design too. So at the end of the document, and this is the end of the talk section, there's these recommendations for if you want to welcome designers and make your open source project more habitable for designers. There's a whole series of recommendations. This is just an example of one of them, feedback cycles, and yeah, there's all these success sections. And on that, I will say thank you, and maybe there's a minute for a question. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you, Eriol. We've got time for a question, maybe two.
I'm going to ask a really unfair question, and it might raise a bunch of thoughts. Did you ask if... I was interested if you asked about the neurodiversity of the designers and the developers. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to just put the mic away.
We did not, no. We did not ask for any of the designers to disclose any, or the projects. We actually didn't, we left it up to the designers that we selected to notify the projects, should they want to notify the projects that they were participating in the study, because it was all anonymous, so there wasn't the risk. But no, we didn't ask about those kinds of challenges. But one thing I think is connected. The 5 designers were from Europe, Canada, USA, Nigeria, and Brazil. So we tried to get, we didn't get much of East Asia, sadly, and Southeast Asia, but maybe next time if we get more funding. The people that were not, I know there's a better way of saying this, but English is a first language. Sorry, I can't remember the better term for it now, but people that were communicating in English that didn't feel like they could express themselves as well in English as their native language really struggled to make contributions for design, because a lot of it is about communicating why the design is important, what it's trying to tackle, what it's trying to solve, and also just the whole facilitation aspect of design in open source was really tricky when there was a language situation happening. So I imagine similar to any other kind of communication challenges, yeah.
I'm afraid that is time, but thank you very much.